The plan is to explore together some of the ideas that are presented in this book, which came out this summer. As you see, it's What Happens in Mindfulness, Inner Awakening and Embodied Cognition. And the book covers roughly equally both mindfulness and inner awakening. But because of the constraints of time, I'm going to focus mainly on mindfulness. If your burning interest is in inner awakening, then the last section we'll get to it, and I'm aiming to leave time for questions and answers so we can maybe focus on that there. But there's just a lot to get through that we have the opportunity to get through. And so I really think we're best to focus primarily on mindfulness. And for me, the core message for myself in writing this was one of hope, really, that's founded on the fact that for very good evolutionary reasons, our heart minds have an inherent, intrinsic, innate potential for wholeness. And that potential underpins another path to greater aliveness and well-being than the one we normally try to follow. And it also provides an alternative to our normal strategy for seeking happiness that most of us follow, and that you probably have observed, and along with the wise people for millennia, that it doesn't lead to lasting happiness. So that's one of the key ideas that we'll be looking at, this intrinsic potential for wholeness. The other key idea is that we've got two different ways of knowing. A conceptual way, which you're very familiar with, and a holistic, intuitive way that you're probably less immediately familiar with. And that the normal way we try to seek happiness is really by relying on conceptual knowing. That's the way of knowing that has served us well in many, many other areas. And so when it comes to looking for happiness, it seems natural to turn to that. It turns out that the particular way we choose to use conceptual knowing creates enormous problems. And in fact, it actually creates unhappiness rather than happiness, certainly not lasting happiness. Our alternative way of knowing, holistic intuitive, although it has a much longer evolutionary pedigree than the conceptual way of knowing, is less well known to us. But this is the way of knowing that offers us the way out, offers us a new opportunity. And the way mindfulness fits in here is that it rebalances the relationship between our two ways of knowing. As I say, normally our sort of default mode that we usually fall into is one where conceptual knowing is the dominant influence in our minds. And the ideas I want to put forward are to suggest that mindfulness rebalances the mind so that holistic intuitive knowing holds sway, and that in doing that, then the heart-mind's intrinsic inherent potential for wholeness, for whole-making, for healing, is liberated. So, just as one sort of summary phrase, mindfulness makes us whole. Now, you might wonder, well, why do we need to be made whole? If we've got this intrinsic potential for wholeness that evolution has bestowed on us, what's the problem? Well, if we just look at our normal state of consciousness, normal here is in inverted commas to indicate, although it's very common, it's not normal in the sort of evaluative sense. It's not really how it should be. This is a study probably many of you will be familiar with, a classic study in which Killingsworth and Gilbert contacted people through their iPhones at random intervals during the day and asked them to rate how happy they were, to indicate what they were doing, and crucially to indicate whether their minds were on what they were doing. And if their minds weren't on what they were doing, to say whether they were thinking something pleasant, something unpleasant, something neutral. And what they found, as you see here, is that minds wandered 47% of the time. So that is, they were doing one thing, but thinking of something else. Their minds were fragmented, divided, not whole. And that state of mind wandering was associated with less happiness than when their minds were on what they were doing. Now you might think that, okay, fine, when people's minds wandered to negative thoughts, worries, ruminations, this kind of thing, naturally they'd feel less happy. But they found that even when people were thinking neutral thoughts, they were less happy on average than when their minds were focused on what they were doing. I just should say, that doesn't mean that they were necessarily mindful of what they were doing. They were just maybe thinking about it. And even when they thought of pleasant thoughts, they were no happier on average than when people had their minds focused on what they were doing. And really importantly, the extent and nature of mind wandering accounted for much more of the variability in people's happiness than the kinds of things they were doing. So normally we would think, if we want to feel good, then let's do something that will make us feel happy. Let's engage in some positive activity. Let's do something we like. But in fact, the actual nature of the activity in which people engaged accounted for relatively little of the variability in the happiness. The key thing was how much their minds were actually on what they were doing. And the really crucial piece that we add to this is that in a review of the literature on mind wandering back in 2015, these two authors concluded that practices that encourage individuals to be mindful of the present are currently the most empirically validated technique for minimizing the disruptive effects of mind wandering. So, mindfulness to the rescue. Here we have a situation in which our minds are wandering this enormous amount in everyday life, that's associated with unhappiness. Mindfulness can counter mind wandering, and so obviously raises the possibility that mindfulness can increase our happiness by reducing mind wandering. In fact, one of the themes that we'll be looking at throughout the morning is the relationship between mindfulness and mind wandering, because on the positive side, mindfulness of the present is the most powerful thing to disrupt mind wandering. But on the other side, as I'm sure all of you who are meditators will be only too aware, the main obstacle to being mindful is mind wandering. So we've got this two-way relationship between mind wandering and mindfulness, and we're going to be looking at that, unpicking it to understand what mindfulness is and how it has these effects on mind wandering. So people have looked at mind wandering in research in two broad ways. One is through brain imaging work. The other is sampling what people actually report their minds wander to. And interestingly, they discovered that the brain networks that underpin mind wandering are ones that had previously been identified as what happens when subjects in experiments are, if you like, resting, so that they're in an experiment doing the experimental task and their brains are being scanned, and then they have a rest period. And what became apparent was that there was a consistent pattern that got activated in the brain networks in those rest periods, irrespective of what the task had been. And they eventually discovered that this default network, the network that the mind seems to default to when it's not doing anything else, underpinned mind wandering. And through that brain research, it's been able to pinpoint the crucial role of conceptual knowing in mind wandering. As it says here, the default network is implicated in the storage, retrieval, integration of conceptual knowledge. Concepts form the basic building blocks of more complex self-generated thoughts, our autobiographical memories, and future plans. Or as Dan Goleman and Richie Davidson put it more accessibly, our minds wander mostly to I, me, and mine. Our default mode continually rescripts a movie where each of us stars. So this is the inner narrative that we carry around with us all the time, that is focused on I, me, and mine, and is underpinned by conceptual knowing. So, so if we now just home in a bit and look more closely at this conceptual knowing that is so central to mind wandering, it's the kind of knowing that we're most familiar with, the kind of factual meaning, factual knowing. The cat sat on the mat, and it expresses meaning by a sequence of separate concepts, each of which has a specific and explicit meaning, and you link them together in chains, often with a sort of subject-verb-object structure, and that conveys a very specific and explicit meaning. And this just reminds us that the concepts that underpin conceptual knowing are actually ideas. It's very easy to slip into the idea that, well, these are just labels for real things, but actually they are ideas when you look at them more closely, and we'll be coming to that more shortly. Interestingly, conceptual knowing is a uniquely human way of knowing. Excuse me. It only evolved relatively recently in evolutionary terms, at most 200,000 years ago. And in fact, the consensus seems to be that the reason it evolved was to support early humans in communicating with each other so that they could cooperate together towards social activities geared towards a particular goal. So you specify the goal with your explicit, specific way of knowing and meaning, and you tell people how to get there and arrange them together. And so this is a way a group can work together. It can pass on skills about how to make tools. It can organize a hunt and so on. And in many ways, this development of conceptual knowing is seen by many as, the reason why we have spread in the way that we have, not always to the benefit of all around us, but that underpinned our, great evolutionary advance. And this, it's all focused on goal seeking. So this is very instrumentally, the origins of this way of knowing are very instrumental. It's all about getting something to happen, getting what we want, getting rid of what we don't want. And that function, that instrumental function, is served well by a chunked, atomistic kind of structure. So we divide the world up into ideas of separate, self-existing entities, things, if you like. Those things could be selves as well as things out here. Obviously we've got, stools and bowls and microphones and all this, but equally we tend to also have selves as objects. There's Matt, there's me, and we're separate, and we've got an idea of who we are and where our limits are. Second aspect is that the qualities of these things that have been identified and boxed in reflect their inherent properties, so that there are good things, there are bad things. Say there's a cake could be delicious. I mean, in some way that implies that the deliciousness is inherent in the cake itself rather than in a set of conditions. So that if we eat a slice of cake and say, that was a delicious cake, we're attributing it to the cake itself. But if we carry on with the next slice and the next slice and the next slice and the next slice, we'll soon discover that that intrinsic deliciousness doesn't belong to the cake at all. It was the set of conditions we brought to that first slice. And this is a particularly pernicious aspect of this way of thinking. It works fine if you're dealing with physical aspects like hardness of stones and things like that that are useful for practical tasks, but it becomes a bit of a disaster when we apply it to our internal worlds. And also there's the assumption that concepts are in some way equivalent to real things out there, to reality, that thoughts represent reality. And each of these features, which serve the practical purpose that this way of knowing was originally evolved for very well, actually cause problems when we begin to use it outside that realm in terms of how we feel and how we behave in the world. So that very quickly the idea of dividing the world up into these separate things creates this sense of separation and disconnection and sort of this subtle alienation that we often experience if we look carefully. The qualities of things being intrinsic to them sets us up to pursue objects of desire. We think if only I could have this object and then I would be happily ever after because this object brings happiness, or if only I could be this particular kind of self, then I would live happily ever after, because it's inherent to being a good self or a happy self or a successful self that is stable, an aspect of the person. And you know very well the problems that come about most obviously in clinical conditions where people assume that because I'm thinking I'm no good as a person, it means I'm no good as a person, or because I think, this lift will actually drop to the bottom of the lift shaft as soon as I step in. We assume that's real. And in that case, we can see the error of that, the way it's distorted. But actually, most of us are carrying that distortion much of the time. And that's, I'm sure you're aware, one of the themes of Buddhist teaching, the teaching of the finger pointing at the moon, mistaking the finger for the moon. Christina Feldman has this lovely one, the idea of your mother is not your mother. And if you confuse them, then you've got problems. This is in some ways the jewel in the crown of the conceptual way of knowing. It's a strategy for achieving what we want. And we create an idea of a desired future state, a goal, and we compare that with an idea of a current state, and that generates action, and we monitor the discrepancy between these two ideas until we find that they're overlapping, so that the current state matches our idea of the desired state. We've arrived. And one crucial aspect of this approach is that you only are interested in information directly relevant to narrowing that gap. So it's a very focused, exclusive kind of approach, and we'll see some examples of that in due course. Everything else gets excluded. So when it comes to lifting that strategy, which works so well in the outer world, that's what enabled man to build the pyramids, get a man on the moon. So the idea is that it turns out what we try to do with using this strategy in pursuing happiness is that we have this idea of a desired self, a successful self, or a self with a big house, or a lovable self, or a rich self, and we have this idea, and we believe that if only I could be the self I want to be or believe I ought to be, and avoid being the self I don't want to be or fear being, then I'll enjoy lasting happiness. I mean, if you spell it out like this, it just seems daft, you know? But what happens when we're in the midst of this pursuit, everything narrows down just to the pursuit of being this self. And we don't actually have the space to reflect on this. As we're actually aiming to be this self, you know, then it does seem real, you know. So it's like this talk. I originally aimed to give this talk, I think about 5 years ago, you know, and I could say to myself now, right, once I'm the self that's at last given that talk, then I can relax and live happily ever after. And at the time that I'm preparing the talk, that's what it feels like. You know, I'm thinking, oh, wonderful, you know, I'll be on the bus home and that's it, done forever. But in fact, you know, all the evidence is that it may happen, it may not happen, but it certainly doesn't last forever. Sooner or later that fades away, and then we become another self, and we start pursuing a different kind of self. So, right. So just to put a little bit detail on this, because it's so central, this guy, social psychologist, E.T. Higgins, developed this thing called self-discrepancy theory, and he believes that we learned through social conditioning to carry around with us these things called self-guides, the ideas of possible selves, so that the ideal self is our idea of the self we really want to be. The ought self is the idea of the self you believe you should be or ought to be. And whenever there are discrepancies between our ideas of actual self and our self-guides, and they're activated, we register them, we experience some form of unpleasant affect. If it's a discrepancy with what the self we want to be, it's a sort of despondent kind of feeling, you know, we're not being what we want to be. If it's a discrepancy with the ought self, then we feel anxiety, you know, some disease, and we strive to reach a state where there are no such discrepancies. So from this perspective, we could see that the way to happiness is just to eliminate all those discrepancies, satisfy all our self-guides. So we need to become our ideal and ought selves, avoid becoming our feared selves, cease to be our despised or unwanted selves, and in any moment we translate those sort of longer term goals down to a working self that we're moving towards in any moment, you know. So now, you know, for my long-term goal of being this self that has done this talk and I'm away and living happily ever after, you know, I've got to get to the first pause by a certain time and being that self, and if I'm not that self, oh dearie me. So now there are a number of problems with this approach to seeking happiness that I'm sure are very obvious to you. The first and most obvious one is that self-discrepancy theory suggests that we're walking around all the time with these self-guides at the back of our minds. We're constantly monitoring the self I am against the self I want to be and the self I feel I ought to be, I think I ought to be. This means that when I start to feel, say, unhappy, or I experience a physical pain or an emotional pain, then I don't just have the unpleasant sensations to deal with. I've got this discrepancy between this self I am now. I am a self in pain, or I am a self feeling unhappy, and I don't want to be that. You know, I want to be the self that's happy. That's my ideal. And so we add to the experiences we're having. I'm sure this is all very familiar stuff to you, and you'll recognize the teaching of the two arrows probably from the Buddha that I'll just read in a moment. But it's crucial that we're constantly going around, not just approaching things as they are, but with this added piece, you know, is this how my self-guides tell me I want to be or feel I ought to be? So if we just go to this teaching of the two arrows of the Buddha, When an untaught worldling is touched by a painful bodily feeling, he worries and grieves, he laments, beats his breast, weeps and is distraught. He thus experiences two kinds of feelings, a bodily and a mental feeling. It is as if a man were pierced by an arrow, and following the first piercing, he is hit by a second arrow. So that person will experience feelings caused by two arrows. But in the case of a well-taught noble disciple, when he is touched by a painful feeling, he will not worry nor grieve and lament. He will not beat his breast and weep, nor will he be distraught. It is one kind of feeling he experiences, a bodily one, but not a mental feeling. It is as if a man were pierced by an arrow, but was not hit by a second arrow following the first one. So this person experiences feelings caused by a single arrow only. So the second arrow is the unhappiness that is created by that discrepancy that we've monitored between how I am and how I want to be or feel I ought to be. And the noble enlightened one, as opposed to we untaught worldlings, doesn't go there. And we'll see shortly where he does go. He relies more on the holistic intuitive way of knowing rather than the conceptual. But as well as setting up this constant comparing things with how we want them to be or think they should be, this way of seeking happiness also creates a fear that we've got to protect ourselves if we're beginning to get this sense of being the self we want to be or feel we ought to be, and we've worked hard and hard and hard and we've created it, and somebody threatens it, then we react very strongly. We live in fear that it'll be destroyed because we feel the vulnerability of it. And there is this haunting anxiety at the back of our minds. And this is another Buddhist teaching. This is a Zen story called The Gates of Heaven and Hell from the Zen master Hakuin, who encountered a wandering samurai who came up to him. I've got the sun in my eyes, I'll just move over here. Who came up to him and said, "Is there really a heaven and a hell?" And Hakuin said, "Who are you?" "Samurai." "I am a samurai." And Hakuin said, "You, a soldier? What kind of ruler would have you as his guard? You look like a beggar." Samurai becomes angry and draws his sword. So his sense of his self-concept, his samurai identity, which gives him his place in society and which he values hugely, is being threatened. "So, you have a sword. It's probably much too dull to cut off my head." So the samurai gets really angry, curses and draws his sword. And then Hakuin says, in a very soft and gentle voice, "Here open the gates of hell." And the samurai realizes that he's actually risked his life to give him this direct experiential teaching. This is what hell is. Hell is when you're forced to take this extreme action to defend your sense of self. He bows, sheathes his sword, his eyes are full of tears, and Hakuin finishes the teaching with, "And here open the gates of heaven." So letting go of the attachment to this self, that's opening the gate of heaven. So all sorts of problems with the conceptual quest for happiness. As I said, concepts are only ideas, illusory, and when we start to look at whether our ideas of what will happen if we win the lottery, or if we move to a more desirable part of the country, or if we strive to avoid negative things, when you actually look at the evidence as how good we are at predicting those consequences, then we're very poor. Say shopping as an example. People who think shopping is going to make them happy, and they look at it, they see that actually it is the belief that if I have this car, if I have this new razzmatazz, then I'm going to be a different self and people respect me and I'll be popular and so on. they've been able to identify that, and they believe that that will give them lasting happiness. In truth, what happens is that all the positive feelings, or most of them, come in anticipation of getting the new car. There's a little bit of a buzz when you get it, and then very quickly it fades away. And what was meant to be, your new self fades with it. So they're illusory, and they're often in conflict with each other, of course. To be a good worker and a good husband or wife, spouse, parent, citizen, son, daughter, you can't satisfy them all. So you've got an inherent conflict there. As I say, we've got the discrepancy monitoring going to the suffering of the second arrow, the need to protect our self-identities, breeds chronic fear, and crucially, the fact that this conceptual way of knowing splits the world into these separate entities, things, selves, creates this subtle, sometimes not so subtle, sense of separation, disconnection, which particularly in our kind of societies, ones which are very mobile, and we rely a lot on the conceptual way of knowing, and most of us in our jobs, creates this ongoing sense of alienation and things not being right. And you can see this as triggering one of the biologically prepared mechanisms that are meant to hold social primates together, which is that if you get separated from the group, you're vulnerable, and so you experience that separation, once you perceive it, is triggering low-level activation of this system, which makes you feel anxious and a bit depressed, and motivates you back into connection with others. And we're, in the societies that most of us live in, we're living with this all the time, this low-level triggering of this sense of disconnection and the feelings that go with it. Okay, and it turns out that it's this conceptual quest to be a different self that underpins mind wandering. If you look at the content of the thoughts that people's minds wander to, we find that adults rate their thoughts as goal-oriented, personally significant, self-generated. They have a prospective rather than a retrospective bias. And we had Dan Goleman and Richie Davidson's, it's all about I, me, and mine. So that the idea, the support for the idea that actually mind wandering is all part of this quest to become a particular kind of self. And we could argue that that is why mind wandering makes us unhappy, over and above, or not different from really, the fact that it's fragmented rather than whole. You can't separate them, as we'll see. The two go together, because once you're going down the conceptual goal focus route, inevitably you're going to have a fragmented mind. So what is the alternative? So if we turn now to our other way of knowing, holistic intuitive knowing, then we're dealing here with something that's got a much longer evolutionary history. All mammals, certainly, and probably before them, their heart minds have the primary function of assessing the significance for action of the situation they find themselves in, the animal finds itself in. Was that sound a sign of an approaching predator? Is this fruit safe to eat? Does my offspring need care and protection right now? And crucially, if we want to assess the significance of a situation, we need to look at the total configuration of information that's available to us, all the patterns of information that are available to us and the relationships between them, because the significance of information hinges on the pattern of relationships, the configuration of its elements, rather than the elements alone, which is an old Gestalt principle. So wholes have novel properties different from the sum of their parts. So just to illustrate that, if we come across these little bits and pieces, that doesn't mean much of anything, okay? You put them together in a particular configuration, then it means a lot. It has huge significance, as opposed to putting them together in that configuration which, I don't know, depends on your imagination, I suppose. But anyway, even newborn babies spend much more time looking at the kind of images on the left than they do on the right. And if we look at what happens if we just change one of those elements, so we've turned the mouth up the other way around, and it again has a totally different significance. We've now got an unhappy face instead of a happy face. So you can only assess the significance of situations by bringing all the information together at one place at the same time. So you basically need an holistic way of representing that. And whole making in the mind brings all the different patterns together and then creates wholes that reflect the configuration. So if we go back to the smiley face, then we'll have a representation in our minds of a smiley face. We don't have to put all the bits together every time. That would be inefficient. So by creating these wholes based on the relationships, consistent relationships between all the elements, everything becomes much more efficient. And that's why evolution has gifted our heart minds with this inherent potential to create wholes by finding and making connections of relatedness. And I'll explain about these connections of relatedness as we go on. So if we just look at this pattern, this is a pattern that Arthur Koestler, back some years ago, christened a holarchical pattern. And it's a way of organizing systems that's very common throughout nature. You have simpler patterns at the bottom that you bind together in terms of certain relationships between them to create more complex patterns, which are then bound together to create even more complex patterns, and on you go up. And in the mind, what happens is that we take simpler individual patterns of information at the bottom, and we look for connections of relatedness between them, and then reflect that in the next level up, in a whole that reflects what happened in the parts, the way the elements below are related. So if we do this, some of you probably know this very well. If I just ask you, here we've got two sounds and two shapes. The sounds are takati and alumu, and you can see one of these is a jagged kind of shape and the other is a smooth kind of shape. So just take a moment to pair takati with one of those shapes and alumu with the other. Okay, now my guess is that fairly instantly you paired takati with the jagged shape and alumu with the smooth shape. Yep, is that true of everybody? Okay, and that's true of adults and children throughout the world whenever this experiment is done. So somehow our minds are taking a visual pattern, visual patterns and auditory patterns, and finding something that they have in common. And that sort of, if you like to call it a multimodal representation, because it transcends the particular mode of sight or sound, is reflecting what these two things have in common. It's the rate of change of the information is the crucial dimension. Okay, so if we go takati, that's sort of changing up and down all the time. Whereas alumu, it's slow. And similarly, if you look at the change in space there, the rate of change with the smooth one is slow, whereas with the jagged one is fast. And so our minds have got this way of picking up this multimodal dimension of rate of change. And that's obviously crucially important because, if in the wild, a creature encounters sudden rate of change, usually or could be related to threat. And if they can put together the fact that the rate of change is high in sound and high in vision and maybe even high in smell, although that's a slower sense thing, then they're in good shape. So we now turn to ICS, which is the framework that I'll be using, that was used in this book, that actually stands for Interacting Cognitive Subsystems, and was developed by Phil Barnard, but I've worked with him over the years and it's been applied. He's applied it to human-computer interaction, to enhancing the creativity of ballet dancers, to evolution of mind, to I've used it to understand relationships between cognition and emotion. It played a role in developing mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And basically the idea is that we can simplify the mind into a number of subsystems, each of which is processes a particular kind of information. And here in a simple mind of a mammal like a zebra or something like that, we've got a very simple structure. So we've got a system that deals with visual information, one that deals with body state information, that's taste, touch, smell, and internal body sensations, and one that deals with auditory information through the ears. And the idea is that the mind discriminates and sees these patterns of relationship between patterns in the different modalities, as we did in the Takati and Alumu exercise, and represents them in a multimodal, a higher level pattern. And that is what controls action and affect in simpler mammals, so that they assess the significance of situations by bringing all these patterns together, seeing if there's a higher order pattern that emerges, and using that to control their action. And the higher order pattern that's actually created is a mental model, which is a bit difficult to get your head around. But if you think of it a bit like the models that weather forecasters use, so you're actually getting measures, indicators of a whole range of different variables: the temperature, the atmospheric pressure, the humidity, time of year, what happened yesterday, and so on. And you put them together into a computer model, and it, from the interrelations between them, it predicts what's likely to happen in the shorter term and the longer term. And you can constantly update your model to improve it all the time. And so the idea is that these models are hugely advantageous to animals, because if you can sort of log what goes with what and what follows what in your experience, then you're at a huge advantage when you go into a situation anticipating what's likely to happen next. Then if you go in with a blank sheet, you just got to work it out, and you probably, by the time you've actually worked out that something's just about to jump on you, they already did. So in non-human animals, this whole-making tendency, integrative tendency of the mind, offers a way to assess the significance of situation. Moment by moment, constantly shifting patterns of different kinds of information arrive, bound into coherent higher order patterns, these mental models, which reflect the underlying patterns of relatedness, what goes with what follows what, if you like, the deep structure. And it's actually very, very hard to often to say what those patterns of relationship are. Like with the Takati and Alumu, it's not immediately obvious. Our minds can do it very quickly like that, but to say what it is more difficult. And this is the basis of the human holistic intuitive way of knowing, based on mental models. So we take what we've inherited from pre-humans, and we enhance it by including, as well as these sensory elements, conceptual patterns. There's more in the mind, there's bits between here and there. But for the moment, the key thing is that these holistic intuitive patterns in the human mind are basically descendants of the mental models in the minds of pre-human animals, enhanced enormously by conceptual contributions. So it looks for patterns of relatedness between what's going on in the sensory world and what's happening conceptually, and binds them together to create a model. Well, I'll talk a bit more about this as we go along, but let me give you a flavour of the kind of model, the representation we're talking about. This is Stephen Covey in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. So this was an incident he witnessed one Sunday morning on the New York subway. People were sitting quietly, some reading newspapers, some lost in thought, some resting with their eyes closed. It was a calm, peaceful scene. Then suddenly, a man and his children entered the subway car. The children were so loud and rambunctious that instantly the whole climate changed. The man sat down next to me and closed his eyes, apparently oblivious to the situation. The children were yelling back and forth, throwing things, even grabbing people's papers. It was very disturbing, and yet the man sitting next to me did nothing. It was difficult not to feel irritated. I couldn't believe that he could be so insensitive as to let his children run wild like that and do nothing about it, taking no responsibility at all. It was easy to see everyone else in the subway felt irritated too. So finally, with what I felt was unusual patience and restraint, I turned to him and said, "Sir, your children are really disturbing a lot of people. I wonder if you couldn't control them a little more." The man lifted his gaze as if to come to a consciousness of the situation for the first time and said softly, "Oh, you're right. I guess I should do something about it. We just came from the hospital where their mother died about an hour ago. I don't know what to think, and I guess they don't know how to handle it either." Can you imagine what I felt at that moment? My paradigm suddenly shifted. Suddenly I saw things differently, and because I saw things differently, I thought differently, I felt differently, I behaved differently. My irritation vanished. I didn't have to worry about controlling my attitude or my behavior. My heart was filled with the man's pain. Feelings of sympathy and compassion flowed freely. "Your wife just died? Oh, I'm so sorry. Can you tell me about it? What can I do to help?" Everything changed in an instant. So what we've got here is the man, Covey, in what he calls his shift of paradigm. We see suddenly his mental model of the situation changing on the basis of conceptual information. Okay, it's taking the whole pattern, but the new element of conceptual information, the mother just died, transforms the whole picture, and it happens instantly. And as he says, the whole climate changed, the whole climate, and suddenly I saw things differently. Because I saw things differently, I thought differently, I felt differently. Everything changed in an instant. So we're dealing with this sort of holistic way of knowing, which instantly gives a response. So he says he didn't have to work out what to do. Compassion just flowed in, and it happened instantly. I don't know, many of you are familiar with this. If you're not, have a look at it and see if you can see what it is. And you'll note, if you can't see what it is, then just squint your eyes up a bit. You may find that helpful. But what happens, it's actually a Dalmatian, a spotted dog, snuffling around in leaves at the base of a tree. But what you'll find when you see it is it all comes at once. You don't get the dog's back leg and then a bit of the tree and then the tail and so on. It all comes at once. So this holistic way of knowing that pulls everything together. So as well as being holistic, this is it's a way of knowing, a way of creating meanings that reflect sensory contributions, as well as conceptual information. So we can talk about it as embodied cognition. Remember, we've got these bits down here, we've got sights, body sensations and sounds that are feeding in to the meanings as well as the conceptual. And so we get, for example, very important effects of body sensations on judgments. Many of you probably know Damasio's book, Descartes' Error, that came out quite a while ago now, where he looked at neuropsychological cases where the bit of the brain that's was damaged that normally integrates body information into other forms of information in making important judgments, important life judgments. And people with damage to that area lead chaotic lives. They simply cannot make wise judgments. There's more experimental evidence. You may be familiar with this idea of an experiment that got people to rate cartoons, either when they were holding a pencil like that, so that their face was in a smiling expression, or like that, so it was in a non-smiling expression. And when their face was put in a smiling expression, cartoons were rated funnier than when they had their mouth like that. Similarly, if you get people to evaluate Walkman headphones and say, well, we just like to see how they go while you nod your head in that direction, for some of them, and the others, they had them nod their head in that direction. And when they were nodding their heads affirmatively, they rated them more positively than when they moved their heads in a negative direction. So unbeknownst to us, what's going on in our bodies is having an enormous impact on the judgments we make, and certainly on the meanings that get created, poetry being the obvious example. So if I read this to you, oh, what can ail thee, knight at arms, alone and palely loitering? The sedge has withered from the lake, and no birds sing. Then most likely you'll get some intuitive sense of melancholy and abandonment that reflects the themes in the mental model created. But the sound of my voice was a crucial element in that. So if I read it this way, oh, what can ail thee, knight at arms, alone and palely loitering? The sedge is withered from the lake and no birds sing. It's sort of, come on, get going. It's a totally different feel. The concepts, the ideas are the same, but adding the element of sound, bringing everything together, transforms the meaning. And if we just go back to the original way of doing it, and you just get this sense of what it does to you, what can ail thee, knight at arms, alone and palely loitering? The sedge has withered from the lake, and no birds sing. And then I ask you, would he be fun to meet at a party? So I think, just like that the answer is no. You don't have to work it out, so that model is rich in implicit knowledge that can be pulled from it in certain situations. So we're going to begin now to look at some of the implications of the background stuff I've been giving you up to now for understanding mindfulness, both in its more general sense, but also we'll be looking at particular aspects of it and seeing how this way of approaching mindfulness gives us insights. So we've already seen that conceptual meanings contribute to holistic, intuitive knowing. That was the key piece that we saw in looking at the evolution of them. But there's also, we saw the possibility that these models, these mental models that are rich in implicit meaning, can also generate conceptual meaning. So on the one hand, we saw that the information, their mother just died, conceptual to holistic intuitive, has a transforming effect. But we also saw that we can generate specific information about whether this soldier would be fun to meet at a party, from the model we can generate conceptual information. And the key idea in ICS and in what we're going to be looking at in mindfulness is that the two different ways of knowing, the subsystems that handle these two different ways of knowing, are in a more or less constant conversation. That conceptual is feeding to holistic intuitive, which is then generating more patterns of conceptual information, and so the two go to and fro in this conversation. And in the ICS framework, this is called the central engine of cognition, but essentially, though any of you who know any psychology will be familiar with the idea of a central executive or executive resources. Essentially, all different psychological frameworks have come to the conclusion that you have to say somewhere in the mind are these executive resources that handle situations that you can't deal with through sort of pre-programmed, routinized, automated routines. So these are novel situations or complex situations or challenging situations. All these, if you like, require mental work, and the amount and the use of what is generally seen to be a limited amount of executive resources. So in some ways you can only do one complex thing at a time. You can get on with something else that's already pre-automated, but there's a limit to the amount of executive resources that you can deploy to different tasks. Now, as in any conversation, one partner or the other can have a dominant influence. And the idea is that in our normal way of thinking, what we saw with the mind-wandering study, sampling our normal way of being, the conceptual way of knowing is in control. That's what underpins thinking, mind-wandering, and this goal-focused processing. We are conscious, certainly, when either of these two subsystems dealing with knowing are involved, but the consciousness is of a sort of thinking kind. We're aware of the experiences of thinking. Whereas if the holistic intuitive is in control, our consciousness has the flavor much more of awareness. And so the key idea is that mindfulness involves a shift from our default mode, which is where conceptual knowing is in control, and then that just defaults to our inner narrative and our attempts to find happiness by becoming the right kind of self. We switch out of that in mindfulness. We rebalance the mind so that holistic intuitive is in control. And the crucial thing is that you can only have one of these ways of knowing in control as the dominant influence in any moment. So one excludes the other, which is why we have this reciprocal relationship, the two-way relationship between mind wandering and mindfulness. If holistic intuitive is on the case, that squeezes out mind wandering, which depends on conceptual information being in control. If it's the other way around, if this is in control, it squeezes out awareness and mindfulness. And if neither of these knowing systems, subsystems, are involved in processing a particular stream of information, then we're on autopilot. We're not aware of it at all. So we have these three basically different shapes of mind. And the key idea, is that we can, by paying attention in a different way, we can reconfigure the shape of the mind. So, as we'll see in due course, coming to John Kabat-Zinn's famous paying attention in a particular way. By paying attention in a particular way, we change the shape of the mind. We reconfigure the mind from the dominance of conceptual knowing in thinking and mind wandering, coupled with automatic pilot, as it often is for, while we're lost in thought, we get on with other things, with driving the car on automatic pilot or whatever. and we reshape the mind to one where holistic intuitive knowing is in control. Mindfulness offers a way to reconfigure, change the shape of the mind to empower holistic intuitive whole-making. So that's releasing our inherent intrinsic potential for whole-making and using it to create novel mental models. Now I've put novel here in bold, and you'll get slide after slide where that is emphasized. It's when you've got to do mental work to create new or modified models rather than just being able to use old ones that you pull off the shelf. That's the key thing in mindfulness. And I can illustrate that if I just read out to you probably a passage you're very familiar with from Thich Nhat Hanh's The Miracle of Mindfulness. I remember a number of years ago when Jim and I were first traveling together in the United States. We sat under a tree and shared a tangerine. He began to talk about what we would be doing in the future. Whenever we thought about a project that seemed attractive or inspiring, Jim became so immersed in it that he literally forgot about what he was doing in the present. He popped a section of tangerine in his mouth, and before he'd begun chewing, had another slice ready to pop into his mouth again. He was hardly aware he was eating a tangerine. All I had to say was, "You ought to eat the tangerine section you've already taken." Jim was startled into realizing what he was doing. It was as if he hadn't been eating the tangerine at all. If he'd been eating anything, he was eating his future plans. A tangerine has sections. If you can eat just one section, you can probably eat the entire tangerine. But if you can't eat a single section, you cannot eat the tangerine. Jim understood. He slowly put his hand down, focused on the presence of the slice already in his mouth, chewed it thoughtfully before reaching down and taking another section. Good boy. So if we look at what's happened here, this is the fragmented mind while Jim was thinking of future plans. This is added to what we had before, these other bits that feed the conceptual subsystem from these. But what we see, it illustrates one of the key ideas, that the conceptual subsystem has no direct connections to these sensory inputs. It can float free. And that's what happens when we get lost in inner worlds of mental time travel. The power of conceptual thought is that it can do that. We can imagine future states of the world. That's what a goal is. And we do that by disconnecting ourselves from sensory input. And here thinking is only involving these three subsystems, the two knowing systems and the speech. This is translating it into inner speech, and the sort of conversations, information flowing around there are supporting future plans. Mindless eating is just being handled on a relatively automatic basis by well-oiled, well-established connections between visual system, subsystem, and the one that controls movement. And these are barely involved at all. So we've got a fragmented mind, two different things happening. Only one of them actually we have any real consciousness of, and these sort of left out in the cold. Now he then says, focus on what you're doing, become mindful, and everything shifts. So we've got holistic intuitive in control. It's drawing input in from the sensory subsystems. It's also taking in information from the perceptual. So we've got a real sort of multi-dimensional experience here. We're seeing the tangerine, we're tasting the tangerine, smelling the tangerine, hearing any little pips and squeaks as we peel it and eat it. These are anchoring holistic intuitive knowing in this moment. Okay, it can't float away because it's anchored by these sensory inputs in a way that the conceptual isn't. And this route is just telling the mind, this is a tangerine, and that is feeding into the whole model. So we've got these sensory patterns coming together with the conceptual label, and we create a model of this eating experience that is rich and multidimensional. And as we'll see, because it's constantly changing, we're having to update the models. It has this sense of freshness about it. And crucially, this is a unified mind as opposed to the fragmented mind we saw before. So the idea is that the mindful pattern supports flexible creation of novel, bespoke mental models, so ones that are tuned to the specific of this situation in this moment to moment, offer the best fitting wholes to integrate all the bits and pieces that are coming in. And I bang on about this crucial importance of the novelty of the models, because it's only in relation to the flexible, creative creation of novel, tailor-made mental models that we experience any good feelings. When it's automatic and we're accessing ready-made mental models from long-term memory, then it just happens. It just happens and we're not really aware of it very much. I can illustrate that using this, which a number of you may be aware of in a different context. Okay, so John was on his way to school. So just that fragment of information will bring up from your memory a pre-existing model that's already sitting there based on past experience. And in that model, you'll know, for example, most likely it's morning time. John is probably carrying a bag, and you may be encapsulated all in an image of a boy walking to school with a bag over his shoulder. Then he was worried about the math lesson, so you can refine it a little bit, past knowledge about children worried about their schoolwork. He'll have butterflies in his stomach, perhaps, even though there's no mention of that. He won't want to go to school, no mention of that. So these models buy you all this extra information and implications. But up to now, you're not aware, I suspect, of doing much in the way of mental work or feeling much in the way of any particular affect. Then he was not sure he could control the class again today. Whoops. So the model that you had for making sense of things no longer fits. You have to do a quick double take, but you've already got a model in there. Teacher struggling to control class. So you change the identity of John from a worried child to a worried teacher, and everything fits together. You may have had a bit of a wobble, but no big deal. And then it was not part of a janitor's duty. So thank you for laughing, those that did, because that makes my point. It's only when you have to actually create this new model, this novel model, in which you bring together at least two different other old models, staff members standing in for an absent teacher, and teacher struggling to control the class, that you can create the model that makes sense of this. And when you do, it takes mental work, and when you resolve it and everything hangs together and you get wholeness, it feels good. Some of you laughed, some of you might groan. The same is true of certain kinds of jokes. So a sandwich walks into a bar and asks the bartender for a beer. Now, you don't really need to work that hard just to change the ordinary model and have a sandwich walking into a bar. No big deal. But then the bartender replies, "I'm sorry, sir, we don't serve food here." Okay, so thank you again for laughing, because what you had to do was rejig your model. Okay, your existing model didn't make sense because he's not asking for food, he's asking for a beer. So it's actually don't serve any bits of food that happen to walk into this bar. That's the policy of this establishment. Okay, so again, it's only when you have to do the mental work to actually create a novel model. You probably like John was on his way to school, you're making new models. I mean, how many times in your life have you made a model like that of a sandwich asking for a beer? It's only the flexible whole making that feels good. And we've seen that in the John was on his way to school exercise. Eureka moments are like that, when suddenly you get an insight. Everything fits and hangs together. There's a sense of joy about it. Jokes we've looked at. And if you look at flow, flow is one of those very interesting situations, where rock climbers or surgeons or chess players will do what they do for its own sake, for the experience of flow, because the joy of doing it in a flowing kind of way. But it's only when the task they're engaged with is challenging that they get into flow. Only when they've got to do mental work to manage the task skillfully that they get into the flow state. If it's not challenging enough, they just revert to their old models that they can pull up from memory, and they don't feel much at all. So, and indeed, Ellen Langer, who was a Harvard psychologist, who was one of the first people to actually emphasize a different kind of mindfulness, did this neat little experiment where she took a symphony orchestra, and this is her, by the way, actually giving a talk like this. She took a symphony orchestra and asked them to play the finale from a Brahms symphony in two conditions. Either replicate your best performance, so pull up from memory your recollection of that best performance and do that, or make it new in very subtle ways that only you would know. So that involves some flexible creative work in the moment. And then she asked the players and an audience to rate how they felt about it. The musicians rated their enjoyment much more in the second condition when they had to do the mental work, and the audiences also enjoyed the music more in that situation. So we have this pattern where there's a link between flexible whole making and good feelings, and it fits quite nicely with this idea of Charles Darwin's, that all sentient beings develop through natural selection in such a way that pleasant sensations serve as their guide. So evolution, we can't come into the world fully equipped, knowing that there is food round the corner, or that particular person will be the person I really feel I've got to share my life with. But we can come into the world with pleasant feelings associated with certain situations, and then learn to seek out those pleasant situations. So by definition, we can't come in pre-programmed to do flexible whole making, but we can come into the world programmed such that when our minds are getting coherent, when whole making is working, when all the bits are fitting together and the ducks are coming in a row, that feels good. And the idea is that that's what we've been looking at in all these examples. When things come together as a result of flexible work, it feels good. And that the idea is that positive feelings are the way the mind's inherent potential for wholeness guides and encourages flexible whole making that creates novel mental models. So here we've opened a new route to happiness. We're saying the core process is this creation of these novel models, moment after moment. That's got to involve coherence of information all the way through the mind. So you're only going to get a coherent mental model if at every one of these different stages of the mental hierarchy are things coming together in a coherent way. So you need some guidance from these positive feelings to move things in that direction. So we've got these two radically different approaches to happiness. Conceptual knowing offers us this promise that if we achieve these goals in the future, which are just ideas, of how things will be then that outcome will make me feel happy. If I get the car, if I become the self that has the Ferrari, then I will live happily ever after. And it doesn't matter if I'm suffering to earn the money to get there, it's going to be so wonderful when I get there. Holistic intuitive knowing, on the other hand, offers you something here and now based on the processes of the mind in this moment, what you experience in this moment. So it's not dependent on all these fantasies of the conceptual mind. You're shaped up moment to moment as to what will feel good. So the happiness is based on the actuality of the experience of successful, flexible homemaking lived right now, a focus on current real-time process. Okay, so very easily to see here that if that's what the essence of mindfulness is, no wonder it's learned by attempting to cultivate beginner's mind and experienced as beginner's mind. You know the quote from Suzuki, in the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, in the expert's there are few. So the expert can just pull on all these mental models stored in memory and doesn't have to do the mental work in the moment, whereas the beginner has to. And so in mindfulness, we're creating these novel mental models moment after moment after moment, and we have a sense of life unfolding afresh in each moment, being present, engaged, alive, as novel mental models and worlds of experience are created from one moment to the next. Okay, we'll just deal with this and then we'll take a break. So just to see how all this fits with what is probably one of the most widely adopted ways of describing mindfulness, John Kabat-Zinn's operational definition, as the awareness that emerges through paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally, to the unfolding of experience. So we're going to reconfigure the mind by paying attention in these ways. And we can see that on purpose, we do that. All psychological approaches agree that on purpose, intentional conscious behavior requires the executive resources. And here it's in mindfulness, they're involved certainly, with the balance being towards the holistic intuitive. In the present moment, if we've got the holistic intuitive in control, then it is inevitably anchored in sensory experience, coming in moment after moment after moment. So if we pay attention to the present moment, we're more likely to flip into this shape rather than the conceptually dominated one, which tends to take us away into the future, and non-judgmentally. And here we're back to the essence of one of the conceptual strategies, which is you have an idea of how things are and an idea of how they should be and you want them to be, and that is the kind of evaluative judgment that you have to steer away from, that you attend in a way that's non-judgmental in that kind of evaluative sense. So in mindfulness, you try and let go of that tendency, and that flips you towards the holistic intuitive. And just finally, awareness. All the neuroscience research suggests that two ingredients are crucial if you want to be consciously aware of an experience. The first is that they involve executive resources. So that would be true of either of the patterns, with conceptual in control or holistic intuitive in control. But there should be coherence between different widely distributed patterns of information. So we've got that in mindfulness with all the mind involved. So here it's widely distributed information coming in from throughout the mind, whereas in the conceptual dominated mind, it's fragmented. We've got executive resources involved, but we haven't got the widely distributed. These are neglected. That's just getting on with its own thing. So, time for coffee.